I recently did the video where I talked about the cake and the rain and the Jimmy Webb song, MacArthur Park. And it reminded me of another story that comes from radio and music. And it's interesting because I've bought a lot of books on a lot of topics, and I'm one of these guys that keep all the books I've ever bought. So I bought a book back in 1984 called Rocking America by Rick Sklar. And the reason this is cool is that I was working in radio in the early 80s, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with my life. I wanted to be a disc jockey. I thought I was going to go into radio, and actually I was in radio for a little while at this point in time, but I wasn't quite sure if that's where I was going to wind up being. And of course, as you may have guessed by now, after working in radio for a while, I became an attorney. And I've been doing that for 30 some odd years, as I like to say. But I always found radio fascinating, just absolutely fascinating. And I was reminded of this book, and I was recently unpacking some of my books and putting my bookcases together and so on. And I came across this book called Rocking America by Rick Sklar, which came out in 1984, and I bought it in hardcover, so that means I bought it right around the time it came out. And it's interesting because I was flipping through the book, and I hadn't seen the book in a long, long time. And I came across a reference in the book where Rick Sklar was the program director of WABC in New York. And it's one of the first big, huge top 40 stations, so big that their influence was important. If they added a song to their playlist, there's a good chance it was going to be a hit because other stations copied them. So if they added a song, everybody else added the song. And so he had these meetings once a week where he'd sit down with people on his staff that he trusted and said, hey, let's listen to all the new songs that have been sent in to us by the different record companies to decide what we may or may not want to add to our playlist. And in the introduction to the book, he talks about the time that MacArthur Park was sent to him by a record company before anybody had heard it, before anybody had heard the song. He got this song, and the first thing he looks at it is he goes, wait, at a time when most records ran 2.5 or 3 minutes at the most, this song was 7 minutes and 20 seconds. It was produced by songwriter Jimmy Webb and sung not by a career vocalist, but by British actor Richard Harris. So those things caught his attention, but he played the song for the group of people, and after all 7 minutes of it had run, he realized that they're all sitting there going, can you play that again? And so he realized they had a hit on their hands, and there was some issues with the record company because they'd sent it to him despite the fact they weren't ready to promote it yet. And when he said he was going to add it to his playlist, they're like, oh, wait, hang on, we got to press copies of the record then because we weren't actually expecting you to add it. He's like, then why'd you send it to me? So he sat on it for a couple weeks, and then he played it, added it to the playlist. The rest is history. It became a number 2 hit in America, technically speaking. I mentioned that it was a number 1 hit. I was mistaken because I should have clarified. It was a number 1 hit in a bunch of other countries, but in America, it only hit number 2. Okay, so that's not bad, but it's not number 1. So, however, when I saw this book, Rocking America by Rick Sklar, it reminded me of one of the funniest stories I've ever heard having to do with music, ever. Absolutely ever. And he talks about how, as the program director of a radio station, people would bring him music. I want you to play this song. And record promoters were quite common back in the 60s and 70s. And it got to the point where he'd have to say, I won't meet with you guys. I won't talk with you guys. And he says they do things like sneak into the building and hide in the men's room. And if you went in there to take care of business, they might jump out of a stall and go, hey, have you heard the new song? And they got a record they want to hand it to him. And he just said, well, it's part of the business, I guess. He just put up with it. But it got to be kind of annoying because he really wanted to base what music they played at the radio station on what the stuff sounded like, not who had promoted it or with what gimmick. But some of the gimmicks they used were actually kind of goofy, and there's a very, very funny story about one of these things involving Elton John. So he's talking about how the promotion men who worked on the record companies, records for Elton John, had problems because apparently, and he says it was Elton John, but he says Elton John would insist on releasing more singles off of an album than was probably appropriate. So occasionally, there'd be a few songs that came out, they did okay, and he'd say, well, I want that one to put out. And so he'd keep insisting on these singles being put out. Again, I don't know if Elton John's really behind that or not, but he says it was. But he says that Rock of the Westies contained some obvious hit songs, but some of the music might be called filler material. That is, added to make sure that both sides of the LP have enough music to sell as a legitimate album. under intense pressure, the record company had released every potential song that might work on the charts, but the word was that Elton John wanted another hit from the album. Confusion reigned. The remaining songs didn't sound like top 40 hits. Finally, in desperation, they tried a trick. And this is the kind of thing that would work in the old days, but would not work today. And this is right at the cusp where somebody might figure this out. The record company would put out a two-sided single and put a song on one side and a different song on the other side. Now, you might not realize this, but radio stations routinely got promotional copies of songs where the same song was on both sides of the single, so you couldn't accidentally play the wrong song. But those are promotional singles, and also that allowed you to keep playing a song, and before it wore out, you could flip it over and play the other side. I'm not making that up. So I worked at radio stations that got 45s that had no B-side. It was the same song on both sides. But what they would do here is they would not label either side as A or B. And they would send the two-sided single out to all the radio stations, and they would tell half the stations that one song was going to be the hit single. They'd tell the other half that, no, it's the other side that we want you to play. And they would try to see which one would work. So he says, in desperation, the company reverted to an old practice that rarely worked. Two different songs from the album were designated as potential singles. And again, I told you about this. So they put I Feel Like a Bullet in the Gun of Robert Ford on one side, and they put Grow Some Funk of Your Own on the other side. Now, you might go, Steve, neither of those were hits. Well, that's what he's getting at. I don't think I've ever heard either of those two songs, although I had a brother who had a bunch of Elton John stuff. I think I may have heard it if the album tracked through while I was playing pool in my basement in Birmingham, Michigan as a teenager. However, they sent this out, and again, half the stations were told, I Feel Like a Bullet will be the hit, and the other half were told, Grow Some Funk of Your Own was going to be the hit. So he says that a record promoter came by the station and tried to pitch him on that song, and he said basically, hey, thank you very much, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. The following Friday, a large carton was delivered to my office measuring 4 feet by 2 feet and a foot high, marked fragile and this side up. The top was designed to lift off, taking the sides of the carton with it and leaving only the base. The carton had been delivered while I was out of the room and placed squarely on my desk. I lifted off the top, and inside was a huge rectangular cake. It was spectacular. I'd never seen any cake like it. On top, along with a decorative border, was a plea in large letters that read, Give Elton a shot. Feel Like a Bullet is a hit. And below the inscription was a cake ornament in the shape of a pistol. Now, the guy had paid a ton of money to have this done, but the problem is that Rick Sklar, programming WABC for the ABC radio network, had a lot of pull in the industry. And as a result, ABC owned stations in other markets. And he was talking to a program director in the other market who casually mentioned, oh, by the way, we just got that new single from Elton John, Grow Some Funk of Your Own. And so Rick Sklar figured out, oh, this is the old two-sided 45 trick. So he did not add Feel Like a Bullet to his playlist, just didn't add it. And so now the guy realizes, the promoter does, that his trick didn't work and the cake didn't pay off. No one left it in the rain, but the cake didn't pay off. So having put such an effort into trying to convince programmers that Feel Like a Bullet was the next single, the man's credibility was about to be blown. How could he face me with another record? And so, of course, he didn't add the song. And just before the next Tuesday morning music meeting at WABC, there was a commotion at reception. Now, promotion people are not permitted in the building on a music morning, but two delivery men managed to get through the lobby and into the station and made a beeline for my office. They brushed past security, opened the door without a word, placed a carton as large as the first one on my desk. So he recognizes that this might be another cake. I was alone in the office. The staff had not yet arrived for the music meeting. I stared at the carton. I hesitated and then pulled off the cover. The bakery had outdone itself. This cake was even larger than the first, but there were no flowers, no ornaments, and no adornments. A simple inscription stretched across its full length that said, Disregard previous cake. Now, that's a great story. And that is, of course, from Rocking America by Rick Sklar. He talks about his life programming WABC in New York and having to put up with record promoters doing all kinds of goofy stuff, including sending him cakes, telling him that I Feel Like a Bullet in the Gun of Robert Ford, or whatever that song title was, is going to be a big hit for Elton John, and you should jump on that and start playing that. Despite the fact they're telling the ABC affiliate in Chicago that, no, Grow Some Funk of Your Own is the single we're pushing right now. So, hey, disregard previous cake. I've always loved that story. Now, the funny thing is that I worked in radio. I started in radio as an intern at a radio station in 1981, I believe. And then I was working at a radio station as a disc jockey being paid in 1983, I believe it was, give or take. And the small radio station I worked at did not have record promoters showing up trying to get us to play records. They just mailed us stuff. We looked at the charts and we played whatever the hits were. That's just how it was. That's how most small market radio stations are. But I actually did work at a radio station at one point in time that was playing the hits. And they had record promoters who still would show up and try to talk to the program director, hoping that the program director would play some song that they were promoting at that time. And I knew the program director at the radio station, and they would actually, to try to get this under control, they'd say, okay, record promoters are only allowed to call or show up on this particular day within these particular time frame windows. And there were actual occasions where a record promoter would show up, and it would always be a young lady because the program director was a young man. And they would always send out these young ladies who were wearing shoes that they bought from Fredericks of Hollywood. And I suspect about half their outfit came from Fredericks of Hollywood, and the other half their outfit was missing. And they would want to go back and schmooze with the PD, program director, about what records they were promoting at that time. And of course, they'd have all kinds of promotional stuff they'd be handing out also, you know. So some band you've never heard of just put out a record, and it turns out they've got swag. So you want a t-shirt that has the name of some band you've never heard of and literally will not be hearing about again 3 weeks from now. But they've got t-shirts. You want those? There's a show coming up. You want tickets to the show? That kind of thing. But record promotion disappeared very shortly thereafter because of what happened to the radio industry as a whole. That's another story altogether. But like I said, thinking of The Cake in the Rain and seeing the Rick Sklar book, it reminded me that not only did he talk about MacArthur Park, but he's the one who got the message on the cake. And then the second cake a few weeks later that said, disregard previous cake. Questions or comments? Put them below those. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.